It's funny how quickly things can go from ordinary to downright terrifying. When I suggested a camping trip, I thought it was going to be just like all the others. Good times with good friends, sitting around a campfire, and maybe telling a few stories to keep things interesting. But nothing would have prepared me for what was about to happen. We started out this morning with the kind of excitement that only a day like this could bring. The air was crisp, the sky clear. A perfect day in Cliff Hill. Mark, Sarah, Emily, and I met up at my place around 9 a.m., packed up the SUV, and hit the road. The drive to the trailhead was filled with our usual banter. Laughter echoing through the car as we sang along to our favorite songs. Mark drummed on the steering wheel, while Sarah and Emily harmonized from the back seat. We were surrounded by towering trees and endless green. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the road. It felt like we entered another world, one where the only thing that mattered was the adventure ahead. It was like any other trip we'd taken before. We were in high spirits, ready for an adventure in the woods. When we finally arrived, we parked the car, loaded up our things, and marched on. The trailhead greeted us with that familiar, comforting scent of pine and earth. I could feel the tension of the week melting away as we hiked deeper into the forest. The sun was shining through the trees, casting dappled light on the path ahead, and the sound of birds chirping overhead made it feel like we were stepping into another world, our own little haven away from the rest of civilization. After a few hours of hiking, we found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing by a babbling stream, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to touch the sky. It was exactly what we'd been hoping for. Secluded, peaceful, the kind of place that felt like it had been untouched by time. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and settled in for what we thought would be a relaxing evening. As the sun began to set, the forest around us started to change. The air grew colder, and the once comforting shadows began to stretch and twist, taking on shapes that made me feel a little uneasy, but we didn't pay it much mind. The fire was crackling, warming our hands as we roasted marshmallows and laughed about nothing in particular. It was one of those moments you wish you could freeze in time, surrounded by friends, with nothing but the sounds of the forest and the flicker of the flames. Then Mark decided to tell us some kind of news he heard. Mark's always been the joker of the group, the one who could turn any situation into a laugh. So when he started talking about the news of a genetically modified bear that supposedly was roaming these woods in search of human meat, we all rolled our eyes and laughed. He told us about some crazy scientist in the capital who had experimented on this bear, turning it into a creature of nightmares, smarter, stronger, and deadlier than any normal bear. He said the bear had escaped from the lab in the capital and was rumored to have made its home somewhere in these very woods. Imagine, he said, grinning as he leaned in closer to the fire. A bear that's only interested in humans. It's learned to stalk its prey, to play with them before it moves in for the kill. Emily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "You're just trying to scare us," she said, though I could see the unease in her eyes. There's no such thing as a genetically modified bear, and if there was, it would be on the news. "Oh, but I trust my sources," Mark replied, his grin widening. "It may not be here, but you never know. It could be watching us right now." We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just Mark's story. It was the way the night seemed to close in around us, the way the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. But I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by the flickering light of the fire and the shadows it cast. As the night wore on, the conversation died down, and one by one, we retreated to our tents. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a dim orange light across the campsite. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring blankly at the tent, trying to push Mark's story out of my mind. But then I heard it, a noise that didn't belong. At first, it was just a rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a deer passing by. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a low, rumbling growl that made my heart stop. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent, careful not to wake the others. The air outside was freezing, and I could see my breath fogging up in the beam of the flashlight. I swept the flashlight around the campsite, half expecting to see nothing but trees and darkness. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something big, moving between the trees a bit far from the clearing. My heart skipped a beat. Whatever it was, if I could see it that far off, then it was definitely not small. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Should I wake the others? Should we run? But before I could make a decision, I heard it again. The growl, low and deep, like the earth itself was rumbling. It was closer this time, and I knew then that Mark's story wasn't just a story. There was something out there, something that shouldn't exist. I turned and bolted back to the tents, my heart pounding in my chest. I shook Mark awake first. "Mark, get up. We have to go, now." He looked at me, groggy and confused. "What's going on, Josh?" "Something's out there," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something big. We need to leave. Right now." The fear in my voice must have gotten through to him because he didn't argue. He was up in a flash, and together we woke Sarah and Emily. They were just as confused, but the look on my face must have told them everything they needed to know. We didn't have time to gather our things. We just grabbed what we could and ran. The trail that had seemed so inviting earlier now felt like a twisted maze, the trees closing in around us as we stumbled through the darkness. I could hear the thing behind us, its heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves, getting closer with every passing second. We were almost at the trailhead when Mark tripped over a root and went down hard. I spun around, my heart in my throat, and saw him lying there, trying to scramble to his feet. What I thought was a root turned out to be bloody bones. The blood was still fresh, and before Mark could get up, I saw it again in the distance. The beast stepped out of the shadows, and it was worse than anything Mark had described. It was massive, easily twice the size of any bear I'd ever seen, its body covered in matted fur that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. But it wasn't just a bear. It was something twisted, something unnatural. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and its mouth was filled with teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. It let out a roar that shook the ground beneath us, a sound so loud and primal that it felt like the forest itself was screaming. I stood there, frozen in terror. But when it began moving, something in me snapped. I grabbed Mark by the arm and yanked him to his feet, my voice barely a whisper. "Run!" We didn't look back. We ran like our lives depended on it, because they did. The sounds of the beast crashing through the forest were right behind us, but we didn't stop, didn't dare to. I could feel its presence, hot and foul, like death breathing down our necks. Somehow, by some miracle, we made it to the SUV. I don't know how, but we did. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. But then the engine roared to life, and we sped down the road, away from the nightmare that had nearly claimed us. Now we're back at my place, huddled together in the living room, still trying to process what just happened. The news is on the TV, and the reporter is talking about a genetically modified bear that escaped from a lab in the capital, exactly like Mark's story. But this isn't a story. This is real. We were out there, in those woods, with that thing hunting us. I can still hear its roar in my ears, feel the weight of its presence as it stalked us through the trees. We went into the forest looking for a fun weekend, and we came back with a story to add to the records of this God-forsaken country. Before I leave, I'll tell you this. If nothing is done and you ever find yourself near the woods around Cliff Hill, stay away, because there's something out there, something that shouldn't exist, and it's waiting for its next prey.